Hello, Hashgraph community. Welcome back to Hash Out. My name is Jim Gao. Today, I would like to talk to you about the fourth service that Hedera just recently announced about a month ago. It's called the Hedera Consensus Service. I'm sure anybody who is involved in Hashgraph, they have heard about it or watched the webinar in which Dr. Lehman Beard introduced this service to the wider community. Dr. Beard was collaborating with IBM to come up with a white paper that outlines the intricacies and the technology behind this HCS, Hedera Consensus Service. I was watching the webinar, and the way I visualize it, what the service does is that you can imagine that at the bottom we have the internet layer, and what Hashgraph is trying to do is to create on top of the internet a consensus layer, the trust layer of the internet. Now, on top of this consensus layer, you have three services. You have the transaction services, the transacting HBARs back and forth, the smart contract, and also the file service. On top of these three services, you have the application layer. Now, what the consensus service, the Hedera Consensus Service does is that it bypasses where applications, decentralized applications, can directly interact with. So through this consensus layer, applications, whether you're talking about stock market, can directly access the consensus layer of the Hashgraph network, bypassing the smart contract layer, the file service layer. So what it does is that it isolates the consensus service, the consensus strength provided by Hedera Hashgraph without bogging down the network with smart contracts. We know that smart contracts consists of codes, and you have to, if you run it, it takes bandwidth, it takes processing power, and it's very inefficient, especially for large quantities of transactions. So what the HCS Hedera Consensus Service does is to bypass that. It still gets what the consensus algorithm can offer from Hedera, but you don't have to run any smart contracts. Rather, the logic governing the application can reside in a centralized location. To visualize it, it's my way of understanding what HCS is. I'm not sure it's that other people in the community shares this understanding, but I see HCS, the consensus service, almost like a decentralized notary. When you think about what a notary is you bring your document here, I'll put a stamp of trust on it and give it back to you. And anybody can bring documents in, for traditional notary. You can bring your driver's license, you can bring your marriage certificate, your bank statement to the notary, and the notary will charge a fee and put a stamp on it and verify that the document is authentic, of course. So it's an authentication process, and that's what I envision Hedera Consensus Service is. It's authentication service, and the difference is that from a traditional notary is that, first of all, it's digital, and second of all, it's decentralized, and the power of trust rather resides in a particular notary that has to go through training and certification to become a notary. Now the consensus power, or the trust power, has been decentralized to millions of nodes that will reside on the Hashgraph network. Right now, the HCS can only do a few functions. For example, time stamping. Time is one of the few very objective items out there that can be reached, that can reach consensus relatively easy. But I would imagine that in the future, especially when there's going to be a global ID system where each person's authentic identity is maintained on a Hashgraph network or even on a Hashgraph shard, then at that time I can totally see HCS replacing traditional notary services all over the world. Like before starting in Hashgraph as an entrepreneur, I was working as a consultant for people who want to study and also immigrate from China to the US. just a typical application for immigration from China to the US, you have to have at least, I would say, 24 notarized documents. And you have to go through either the local police station or the local embassy, for these kind of processes. And many times it's a hassle, for applicants to go through. But in the future, I believe, in combination with the global ID system, the HCS can provide these notary services remotely and on the fly and instantaneously. To a certain point, I can even see Hedera or Hashgraph, these two words, they can become verbs, just like Google. Let's Google it. In the future, you can say Hederize it or Hashgraph it. Eventually, I think it's going to become a norm for society, especially after more people starting using it and start gaining trust in the system, realize, well, this is the consensus layer, where the records cannot be altered, and it's as reliable as any documents. You can take whatever stamp that HCS put on a document or put on a transaction to court. And once there's a understanding in the wider public regarding this service, I think it's going to be a game-changing service. It's going to replace all the industries, all the facets of the economy that relates to trust and notary. Notary is only a small portion of that. There are other parts where trust, is demanded. Right now, the trust reside in a central authority somewhere. Whether it's a bank or a government or an agency or association, there has to be authority there. But in the future, the trust will be decentralized on networks like Hashgraph. So that's I'm very, I think it's a very, very important milestone for Hashgraph. And also, I think it's, to a certain point, I think it's the next revolutionary step on top of the smart contract paradigm. When we think about where does smart contract paradigm come from, it's it's from Ethereum. That's the breakthrough of Vitalik and his team. They were the early adopters of Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is the first decentralized application globally. And Vitalik and his team realized, so we have this chain of immutable records. Now we can actually, program it. We can program this chain and to perform more complex tasks. And that's where the smart contract idea was born. But smart contract is very inefficient, especially, let's say that if you want to design a decentralized exchange, whether it's a stock market exchange or crypto exchange, and every time when you post an order or execute an order, you have to pull this smart contract, run it. Sometimes the smart contract can consist of hundreds of lines of code, and that's going to take time. So the bottleneck of the throughput is not going to be consensus. It's not going to reside with the time to reach consensus, especially on a very robust network like Hashgraph. But the bottleneck will reside with executing the smart contracts, and that's going to be very inefficient. But now with this HCS, the logic of running the software can reside centrally on a server somewhere, while the most critical piece of authentication, the consensus authentication, will be pulled from the wider Hashgraph network. And I think it's a very, very efficient way of reaching consensus. As the community becomes bigger and more applications are building on it, like a global ID system, I think the possibilities in the future are endless. That's why it's a breakthrough, a technical breakthrough in the consensus algorithms. So that's my 2 cents regarding the HCS. Let me know what your thoughts are, whether you agree with me that HCS can be considered as a decentralized notary service. If not, let me know as well in the comments, and we can start a discussion here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you on the next video.